In 2022, to Just Stop Our activist True Soup at Van Gogh's Sunflower painting. When I saw this, I was absolutely enraged. I couldn't understand why they would destroy such a valuable artwork, so I joined in the crowd that started to make fun of them. Then in 2023, there was another protest in Rome by Last Generation, and again, and again, and again. Each one of these protests made me despise the climate movement. But now, 3 years after Just Stop Oil's flamboyant protests, I decided to revisit this topic. Has climate activism gone too far? Some would say yes. They would be in the majority that young me was in and argue that radical climate activism is counterproductive and it alienates more people than it attracts. Others in the small but growing minority would argue no. For one, the simple reasoning that these protests are morally justifiable against an oppressive state. But beyond philosophy, they also point to the radical flank effect that we saw in historical activism like the civil rights movement or the suffragette movement. This video will discuss both sides and try to be as balanced as possible. And at the end, I will provide an answer that isn't simply a yes or no, and it actually depends on what the protest is, and it is up to us to respond to them with a critical mind. Let's start off with a simple question. Are these acts of civil and uncivil disobedience justified? Yes, sometimes. Philosophers often argue that disobeying the law is excusable when the justice system fails us. And we know that the legal system is failing us by producing injustice by protecting the fossil fuel industry, which leads to environmental harms. But that only applies to civil disobedience, without violence and also surrendering to law enforcement. What about uncivil disobedience, where activists destroy infrastructure and avoid punishment? Well, as long as the violence is targeted towards the right group of people, like disrupting fossil fuel operations, it is morally justifiable under proportionality. However, many of the times these protests target the wrong people. They try to disrupt public life to gain the attention of the public, but that then becomes disproportionate. In October 2022, members of Last Generation blocked traffic on a major Berlin highway, leading to the death of a cyclist because emergency services were delayed. When climate protests lead to the death of innocent people, and when the harms it brings are indiscriminately directed towards the public, that is when I think it steps over the line and is never justifiable. Some people say that bad publicity is good publicity, and the radical climate protests certainly think that. Protests need to garner a lot of attention to be effective, and it's undeniable that these controversial protests do get the attention of millions. Less controversial ones, on the other hand, don't. Without Googling, I'm sure you won't be able to tell me about a climate protest that did not involve some sort of controversial act, like vandalism or disruption to daily life. I certainly can't. The attention that these protests gain, however, isn't of mass approval, but of annoyance and backlash. Extreme protests simply alienate people that may be sympathetic to the cause, past me included, and it also gives people who are against the climate movement more evidence to weaponize to paint the climate movement as unreasonable. Even when there is some valid justification behind the protests, like targeting museums for receiving funding from fossil fuel companies, I believe that these justifications aren't well communicated enough. The public is left confused, and instead of gaining support, the protests reinforce the stigma on activism and makes it harder to convince people to support the climate movement in the future. So, under philosophical and practical justifications, climate activism that harms the public is counterproductive. That's why it's not only important to ensure that the actions of activists are directed towards big oil and their partners instead of the public, but it is equally important to make the link between the harm and the victims clear. This tactic will still garner a lot of attention, but it will draw in people to be supportive of the climate movement instead of being against it. However, it's not just as simple as that. History shows us that uncivil disobedience works. In the suffragette movement, women destroyed public property, chained themselves to places, and even went as far as to commit bomb attacks. In the civil rights movement, Malcolm X advocated for violence in the form of self defense against white violence. These are all examples of the radical flank effect, where a more extreme group can contrast with moderate groups in the same movement, making the moderates seem more reasonable and hence approachable. This is most evident with the difference between Malcolm X's and MLK Jr.'s campaigns, where MLK Jr.'s movement ultimately succeeded, and now equal rights for different races are attributed to his non-violent campaign. As for the suffragettes, their violence was not well received by the contemporary public, a parallel to what we see with the extreme climate protests today. However, the actions of the suffragettes are now seen as necessary in achieving women's rights. People dislike activism in the past and in the present because it demands change from people, and people don't want to change. Oftentimes, people take what they have for granted and forget about how they got into their situations in the first place. And that's why violent and non-violent activism has such a negative reputation. Personally, I'm not a fan of violence. I believe in change through words and debate, and as a result, I often condemn protests like these for their violence. And that's exactly the nuance. Whether climate activism has gone too far depends on your personal beliefs and values. For some, their limits might be at the vandalism of artworks. For me, my limit is the death of innocent people. But at the same time, these limits will eventually be reached. There may be deliberate attempts to recreate historical protest, or there may be mistakes made which results in the death of innocent people. When they do though, I think, yes, we should hold them accountable for their actions. If you believe that Just Stop Oil should not have thrown soup at paintings, get mad at them and criticize them. However, you must also recognize why people take such extreme measures. The elephant in the room here is the fossil fuel industry and the governments that enable them. They are the reason why injustice is produced, which leads to disobedience in the first place. If we are able to get mad at Just Stop Oil for simply throwing soup at a painting, we can also get mad at fossil fuel companies for their repeated harms towards humanity. Think about this. Why does a can of soup anger us more than rising sea levels? Why does a traffic jam anger us more than deadly hurricanes? To sum it up, if you want to be outraged at radical climate protests, go ahead. However, you should at the same time redirect some of that outrage towards those who are actively contributing to climate change.